we've been trying to get her for about 2 or 3 years, but between health issues, COVID and whatever, we finally got her. There's a little story behind this. I was actually at Prairie Machine camping this summer, a couple college friends, on the hottest day of the year. So instead of just sitting outside your camper in your campground, when it was 105 degrees. So we said, well, let's go down to Villa Louis and we'll kind of wander around there. We knew, well, Villa Louis was going to be any cooler than where we were. Well, let's just go into the bookstore there. And boy, air conditioning worked. So we're glad about that. And actually, Ms. Antoine wasn't there, but everybody knew her and tried to promote her books and stuff. So I think we're actually in for a really good and interesting presentation next month. So. And for this one,
very good.
Yeah, thanks. This month, Rob Zaleski. No, Rob, you come on recommendation of George Husselberg. Oh, well, anyway, we have to give George a hard time. He's an old neighbor, so. But anyway, Rob will be presenting a discussion on the career of retired Madison Police Chief David Couper. And I know you mentioned David was hoping to be here this evening, but he had a medical or family issue that came up at the last minute. Rob grew up in the working class neighborhood of Bayview on Milwaukee's South Side. It's a small world. It's where my son lives now in Bayview. So, yeah. Anyway, he spent his first 13 years in the newspaper business as a sports writer and editor covering the Packers and University of Wisconsin sports. And he also became an award-winning news columnist for the Cap Times in Madison. His first novel, Searching for Sal, is based in Madison. And before we welcome Rob, he does have some books in back, so after the meeting, feel free to go back there and purchase it. I'm sure you'll sign it. That'll add another $1 or $2 to it. So, anyway, we want to welcome Rob Zaleski. Right, yeah, you can move this over.
Here's the book, by the way. David Couper, Beyond the Badge, Reflections of an Ex-Cop. I was fortunate to get a photograph that was taken in 1990 of me interviewing Couper when he was police chief. So, thank you for coming tonight and for the opportunity to talk about the book and talk about the life of David Couper. By the way, David Couper just recently turned 86, and I'm happy to report he lives out near Blue Mountain State Park in the farmhouse with his third wife, Christine, and he is still in excellent shape, both mentally and physically. Just a remarkable guy. I can't say enough about him. So I thought I would start out just giving you a little bit about my background and how this book came to be. It's kind of interesting. I was in the newspaper business for almost 40 years. And during that time, I've estimated that I probably interviewed close to 8,000 people. Of those 8,000 people, roughly, there were 3 people who stood out, who were so different, so impressive, so inspiring, and those 3 people were, they just stood out from the crowd. The first one was Al McGuire, the basketball coach at Marquette in the 70s, led him to the NCAA title. The second one was Ed Garvey, who I wrote a book about, was the first executive director of the National Football League Players Association in the early 1970s, then became a progressive activist here in Wisconsin, ran for governor. Just a fascinating guy. I wrote a book about him. He died a few years ago, but that book did, much to my surprise, very well. Garvey, one of the funny stories about Ed Garvey was that when he became the 31-year-old head of the National Football League Players Association. And I was sports editor of the Green Bay Daily News. I was 24 years old. We, at the Green Bay Daily News, we were a struggling new daily, and we were struggling to survive financially, and we started breaking stories, scoops, on what was going to happen with the NFL players, and they were going to strike. We were getting nationwide coverage. We were breaking all these major stories. At one point, Bill Dwyer, the sports editor of the Milwaukee Journal, who was my mentor, called me and said, "My God, where are you guys getting these stories? You're beating the hell out of the national media." Well, I didn't tell him at the time, and I kept it a secret until my book came out. Ed Garvey was giving us those stories. He would call us, and we would run it on the front page. He was tipping us off on every new development. That was a hot time in the NFL, a very controversial period. And so Garvey was leading to us the stories. And Garvey would later say that when the National Football League Players Association was struggling to survive in its infancy, he felt that there were only two media sources in the entire country who favored the players. One was the New York Times, and not the paper itself, but Red Smith, their legendary sports columnist, and the other one was the Green Bay Daily News. Greetings, George. Glad you can make it, pal. So, by the way, there was a fourth person who stood out in my 39 years in the business, but only because he was the weirdest individual I ever encountered or wrote about, and that was Dan Devine, the coach of the Green Bay Packers in the early 70s. He's no longer with us, but I could write an entire book on Dan Devine. He was so weird. Anyway, so I covered Couper. I would write about him occasionally when I was a columnist for the Capital Times. And in 1990, toward the end of his reign as police chief, I asked if I could interview him, and he invited me down to his office and said, "Why don't we spend the day together?" It was a hot, steamy day in August, and I spent the day with him, and I was fascinated. I thought, wow, this guy really comes at life in a different direction. George knows that. He covered him for a while for the State Journal. And I wondered, but the one thing that what really intrigued me was he revealed very little about his personal life. That was kind of off limits. And Couper, if you read my book, if you should happen to read it, he endured an unbelievable amount of turmoil in his life, in his private life. He had so many setbacks, it's almost beyond belief. He hid that while he was police chief for the most part. So after that 1990 interview, I really didn't have much communication with David Couper. And then in 2011, after I had been downsized out of my job at the Capital Times, Couper contacted me and told me he was writing a book about the dramatic change in policing in the country, how militarized the police departments were becoming, and he attributed that to an overreaction to 9/11. So he was writing this book, and he asked me if I would help edit it, and I agreed to do that. And I probably visited with him maybe 3 or 4 times, and I became even more intrigued. I thought, wow, this guy is different. He just has such an impressive outlook on life. He's so upbeat, and he's so well read. And the time I spent with him, I could have spent the entire day every time I would meet with him. He published his book, he self-published his book, and then I wrote my novel, Searching for Sal, which takes place in Madison, and which, by the way, I was contacted by several people in Hollywood, a couple of screenwriters and the director, and we were thinking of buying the screen rights to the book, but it never happened. But I'm still trying to, I think it would make a good movie. Anyway, so I wrote my book, Searching for Sal. I did a book on Ed Garvey, and in 2019, I thought the Garvey book was so well received. Is there anyone else who I could do a book? And the format of my book with Garvey was question and answer. I was a terrible interviewer in the early years of my career, and I really worked at it, and I think I've become a fairly good interviewer now. And so that's why I used the Q&A format. I think it really works. I thought it worked well with the Garvey book. I thought I would try it with Couper. The problem, however, was Couper was not known as being real quotable. So it was going to be a tough interview, I realized that. But in 2019, I called Couper on a whim, drove out to his farmhouse near Blue Mountain State Park, where he lived with his wife, Sabina, who had been a Madison police officer and had been suffering from cancer for almost 12 years. David actually was her nurse. He took care of her and did kidney dialysis with her 4 times a week in their farmhouse because she begged and pleaded with him to keep her out of a nursing home or a hospital. And he said, I'm going to do that. But really, that in itself is an amazing story. He would stop in the middle of our interviews, by the way, to go downstairs and do dialysis for about an hour, and then he'd come back up. So I proposed that we do this book. And I said, but I want to be honest with you from the start. It's not going to, I'm not out here to glamorize you. I'm not going to turn you into a saint. This is not going to be a puff piece. I want to write about an honest book about who is David Couper, who is the real David Couper. And I said, I'm going to ask a lot of tough questions, and I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. And it's going to be David Couper, warts and all. And if you're not comfortable with that, I don't want to do it. Couper, to his credit, said, Rob, I'm at this point in my life. He was an Episcopal priest at the time. He had been an Episcopal priest for 30 years. He said, I want that. That's exactly what I want. And that's Couper. There aren't too many people who would agree to a format like that. He was not an egomaniac by any sense of the word. And so he said, when can we start? I'm eager as hell. Let's do this. So we did 19 in-depth interviews in the COVID year of 2020. 4 of them were by Zoom in the midst of the epidemic, which was pretty funny actually because Couper and I are both technophobes, and we had so many problems trying to connect. One of our interviews, the computers crashed or we were doing the wrong thing. My phone didn't work. Couper lost contact with me, got into his truck in the middle of a snowstorm, drove to the top of the hill at Blue Mountain State Park and called me, and we conducted the interview that way. But anyway, we did these 19 interviews, and I can tell you that I suspected there would be some surprises, but I was shocked, quite frankly, at how many surprises there were. One after another after another. He was a far different person than I had ever imagined. I'll just mention a few of the surprises. You know, the book is just full of them. He grew up in Minneapolis. He was not close with either of his parents. His dad was an alcoholic. Berated David all the time when he was growing up for his shortcomings. His mother was cold and distant. He had a sister who was 6 years younger. He had little to do with her. And he had no mentors. I found that hard to believe. In my experience in life and in journalism, most successful people that I've run into had mentors along the way. Couper had none. He had a wrestling coach in high school who, encouraged him to establish himself, to get into athletics, because Couper was really a talented athlete. But that's it. He had no mentors. Then he went into the Marines. Amazing. David Couper, the progressive activist, is in the Marines. This came as a shock to me. Even more shocking is that if you talk to Couper today, he'll tell you his values in life, the system by which he lives by. he got from his time in the U.S. Marines. He credits the Marines for the philosophy of life that he has now. That was shocking to me. He went to college at the University of Minnesota and became a police chief at in Burnsville, Minnesota. He was actually a police officer in that area for about 6 years. His first job as a police officer was walking a beat in a very dangerous, crime-ridden black neighborhood in Minneapolis. And to this day, I'm told that he's revered for having the guts to take on that beat and the relationships that he formed in this black neighborhood in Minneapolis. So he becomes police chief in Madison in 1972, and I find out in the middle of the interviews that his personal life was so tumultuous. At one point, while he was police chief, he had 9 kids altogether. A couple of them were adopted late in life. But at one point, 4 of his 9 kids had serious drug or alcohol problems. One of them was a heroin addict to this day. His oldest son, who lived in California, committed suicide in 2014, a drug addict his whole life. So Couper hid this while he was police chief, that he had that much turmoil in his personal life. And it's just amazing to me. In the middle of his reign as police chief in the mid-1970s, his second wife threw him out of the house. And while he was police chief for almost a year, he would drive out to a truck stop near DeForest and sleep there overnight. While he was police chief, think about that. Couper was sleeping at a truck stop near DeForest. And yet, despite all the turmoil and the police department, the police officers, the old guard hated him because he was introducing one new rule after another, and he was dramatically changing the makeup of the department. I'm just going to read one thing here because I was hoping people would be drawn to this book in part because the David Couper they knew as police chief was quite a bit different behind closed doors. Doug Moe, the award-winning writer in Madison, wrote the foreword for the book. And in it he writes, I'm just going to read this one chapter. Now Zaleski has engaged another controversial and compelling figure. Former Madison police chief turned priest David Couper in a series of conversations, and the resulting book is an amazement, at least to someone like me who felt he knew Couper's story. So I am proud of the fact that that people recognize that, and I think that's the strength of my book, I believe. And yet, with all the turmoil going on in his life, all the craziness, he enacted so many changes to police department life, it's amazing. When he finally stepped down to become a priest, to go into the priesthood in 1993, when he had become police chief in 1972, there was one black officer and no female officers. There were 6 females who were officers in the juvenile section, but they weren't allowed to carry guns or be on patrol. When Couper left in 1993, 10% of the department was people of color, and 25% of the police officers were female. Unbelievable. One of the most progressive police chiefs in U.S. history, and he was honored with a national award after he stepped down. Then, David Couper being David Couper, in 1992, he's already been police chief 20 years. He's married to Sabina, who was a police officer. They're living on the west side of Madison, and they're out jogging one morning, and Couper, who was never particularly religious, neither was Sabina, they're jogging down the street, and Couper stops near where Trader Joe's is now on this summer morning, and he stops and he turns to Sabina and he says, "Okay, now it all makes sense." Sabina says, excuse me, what makes sense? He said, I just had an epiphany. And she goes, yeah, I think I'm going to quit as a police chief and I'm going to become a priest. And Sabina said, are you okay? How many cups of coffee did you have this morning? Well, where is this coming from? But she thought he was joking. But no, he had had this epiphany. It's described in the book. Didn't make sense to me. But he stepped down as chief. About a year later, he gave a year's notice, and he went into the priesthood. I will say that there's one chapter in the book that readers have told me they found to be one of the better chapters and one that most people found humorous, because I'm agnostic and Couper's this priest, and we had some rather vigorous, heated exchanges over religion. So we have fun with that, actually. So he becomes a priest. He spends the next 30 years of his life as a priest at various parishes. The last 10 years of his stint as a priest, he spent at a small church in ultra-conservative North Lake in ultra-conservative Waukesha County. He's the priest there. And there's a chapter that deals with that, of how the people in this ultra-conservative town dealt with the fact that David Couper, the progressive wacko in a lot of their opinions, was now this head priest at their church. That's pretty much, I mean, there are many more chapters that deal with other episodes of his life. I think the chapter to me that was most eye-opening and I could tell was the most painful for Couper to talk about is that in 2017, he's still a priest. He's still very much active in community policing and sending out texts and a newsletter on policing. He takes a job as teaching a course in police community relations at UW-Platteville. And Platteville, as you probably know, is in a conservative county, Grant County. And Couper figured it might be an interesting time if he were to talk about his feelings on police community relations. What he wasn't prepared for was that he's teaching this class, and during the class, one of the things he was teaching was he was encouraging the students in his class. He was telling them his syllabus included black scholars, influential black scholars, and he thought that these police students would benefit from reading these scholars. And Couper's argument was, look, you're 5-6 months away from becoming police officers, and you might be at a police station in northern Wisconsin, and you might have to deal with, say, a black family going from Chicago to Minneapolis, and you might stop them. And this is going to help you deal with them because you have to understand their life is far different from yours. The black experience in dealing with police is really a lot different than what most white people experience in dealing with the police. And this will really help you. Let's have a spirited debate about this. Well, lo and behold, several months later, he comes to a class and he's handed a petition. 17 of the 29 students in his class at UW-Platteville wanted him removed. They wanted him fired. And their argument was to the administration that David Couper was unfit to teach a class on policing. Couper, of course, was not only stunned, but appalled. It's like, what? Never mind that he had spent 6 years as a police officer in chief in the Minneapolis area, or 30 or 21 years as police chief in Madison, and was nationally recognized as one of the top police chiefs in country's history. His 19 and 20-year-old kids did not like what he was teaching, did not like what he was advising them, and wanted him removed. So they took their complaints to the administration at UW-Platteville, and Couper welcomed that, and lo and behold, the administration pretty much supported the students. And he was told that from there on in, for the rest of the semester, his classes would be supervised by an administrator who would be sitting in on the class to watch what he was saying to them. They were going to video it. They were going to hold his feet to the fire, so to speak. They supported the students. When he came home and he told Sabina about this, he was distraught. He couldn't believe it. And he loved teaching the class. He thought he was performing a real service. And Sabina said, "David, you don't have to do this. You're 78 years old. My God, you've had this career that you're proud of, that we're proud of. You don't need this kind of mental anguish at this point in your life. Please tell them to shove it, and that you're quitting and you're not going to do this anymore." So he did. He went back and he said, "My God, with my background, my credentials, you can't support this, and you're going to tell the students they're justified in saying that I'm unfit to teach a class on police community relations? I'm sorry, I'm not." So that was a sour note. It was a tough interview. I could tell it was still bothering him, but he went on with his life. He continued to be a priest. And so then the book came out. Interesting, I'll end on this note that I always thought that if the book were published, the Historical Society would be the one to publish it. And I went to them and told them about this book. And they said, "Wow, fascinating idea, sounds like a great book, but we only publish books about people who are dead." I said, "Really? You're kidding. You're not going to publish a book about Dave?" "No, we've got all kinds of records on him and we know about him. But if he passes away, maybe we can come back to us." That was a surprise. As George can tell you, it's hard to get a book published these days. So I went to UW Press, which had published my book on Ed Garvey, and that book was so well received, I thought they would jump at it. But no, they had a new editor from Berkeley. He had never heard of David Couper. And he said to me, I just can't imagine this book would sell more than 400 copies. We're going to pass. I said, "Really?" I said, "The University of Wisconsin Press is going to not want to publish a book on this distinguished police chief, this highly recognized police chief? No, we're not interested." So I went to Little Creek Press in Mineral Point, and they agreed to do it. I'm grateful that they did. I'll end on this note by just saying that I'm proud of this book. I really am. I didn't know if there would be much of an audience for it, but it's done way beyond what I expected. I was very fortunate to get some very nice reviews. Couper's proud of it too, I think. While I was strictly an objective, I like to think hard-hitting journalist during the interviews, Couper and I have since become friends. I admire him greatly. I didn't let him know that until after the book was published. We meet for coffee occasionally, and I can just tell you that I continue to believe he's a remarkable guy, one of the most fascinating people I've ever met. I'm always amazed by his upbeat attitude and his positive outlook on life in general. Couper starts every day, I may have mentioned this earlier, he begins every day, he wakes up at 86, and his first thought is, what can I do today to make the world a better place? And I gotta tell you, I so respect that. You can't help but, if you hang out with David Couper for any time at all, you just come away feeling good about yourself, feeling hopeful about the world, that there are still people like David Couper left who are so inspiring. So Anyway, on that note, any questions you have, feel free to ask. Yes?
I guess I'd like to know more about Couper himself. What was the biggest accomplishment, other than the diversity of the force that you talked about? But I mean, he was there at a pretty tumultuous time.
Yeah, it was, I think, what was he most proud of?
Yeah.
I think he was proud that he had changed the department, not only bringing in people of color and more women, but he changed the whole attitude of the police department. It was old school, you know, tough guy police department when he became chief. And at the end, it's a very progressive police department that even, you know, it's progressed beyond that since he retired, but more into helping human beings, more into you know, looking out for the have-nots of the world. He definitely left his mark. I've talked to a number of his officers who were there in his reign, and they said you had to be there to realize just how dramatically he changed the mindset. I think he's also proud of the work he's done as a priest. Not surprising. You know, it's funny, have any of you ever heard of the Peace Council? The International Peace Council? Well, there's a chapter in the book. The Peace Council, I mentioned the Peace Council in my novel, Searching for Sal, which I said told you was based here in Madison. And a lot of people said, wow, that section, that part of the book, the Peace Council, that's hilarious. How did you come up with that idea? I mean, there's a place called the Peace Council, and Desmond Tutu from South Africa is a member, and the Dalai Lama, and all these great religious figures, and it's based in Madison, Wisconsin. How did you come up with that idea? And I tell them, well, guess what? The Peace Council did exist. It was in existence for 9 years, and it was headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin. And the members included the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, I mean, some of the greatest religious leaders from all over the world, but they kept a low profile. The guy who started it was actually a utility executive from Madison, Daniel Gomez Ibanez, who lived just outside Madison, in Cambridge. And Couper was a member. And so he got to meet all these figures, and there's a chapter in the book about his time with the Peace Council. And it's fascinating. And they accomplished quite a bit. They went to Cambodia, and they got the UN to pass a law regarding, or a resolution to eliminate all the landmines that were left in Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge took over and destroyed that country. And the members of the Peace Council marched for like 10 straight days in 100-degree heat, trying to get world recognition of this incredible problem there in Cambodia. So there is a chapter in there about the Peace Council. So he was proud of his work there, and he's proud of the work he's done as a priest. And I think David Couper is very much aware of the positive impact. I went to a get-together at his house in the summertime. And the people in the area just cherish the time that they spend with Couper. He's just so down to earth. I mean, Couper is not at all intimidating. He's someone that if you meet at a party, he'll come over and talk to you and ask you about your life, and he's sincere about it. He's very sincere about it. So. Yes?
He was such a dramatic change from the police that were before him in Madison. What was the decision-making process in Madison at the time that got somebody like that into that position?
You know, Couper talks about it. Nobody was more surprised that he was chosen as police chief than he was. But there were several members of the city council at the time. The Civil War, I mean the Vietnam War protests had gone on, and they remember the campus was...
I was there.
Oh, okay, there, yeah. And so there were several people on the city council who decided we need to dramatically change. The world is changing. There are these riots going on campus. We need a different approach than just, you know, billy clubs and guns and the hardliner. We need to move away from that. The vote was very close. I think it was 3-2 that he was appointed. He was really surprised. He was 32 years old at the time, and he couldn't believe that Madison was willing to take this step. And I got to tell you, nobody was more astounded than the police union and the police officers themselves. He talks about in the book, and I'm just paraphrasing now, that at one of the first meetings, he was at the meeting and he had a mustache. And the head of the police union said, oh, by the way, as police chief, you're going to know that we've got a rule around here. We don't allow mustaches. And Couper, who was smoking a cigar, looked at the guy and he said, well, I guess we're going to have to change that rule, huh?
Oh.
And everyone at the meeting was like, whoa. And they did change the rule about facial hair and whatnot.
Did Soglin play a role at the time?
You know, Soglin did play a role. He was a young radical, supposedly, at that time. And he and Couper were very close in the early years. They had kind of had a falling out in the late 80s, the early 90s. We touch on that a little bit in the book. But, yeah, and to be honest, I do think, I mean, Couper did have an ego, don't get me wrong. And I think at that point, it really was a clash of egos. And Couper was winding down. He was looking for a new challenge. And so that's where, you know, this epiphany comes in, and where he took his life in a rather unusual direction. He does not regret that at all. Sabina, by the way, finally bought into it. I think she was still puzzled to the very end that he had taken his life in that direction, but she was very supportive. Amazing woman, by the way. They were an incredible couple. Couper talks about his failings as a man in his first couple marriages and what a terrible husband he was, not much of a father. And Sabina changed all that. When he had this epiphany and he told Sabina that he was going to go into the priesthood, that was his dream now. He told her, I want to make clear one thing. If you're opposed to this, I'm not going to do it. I mean, if you have any problems with this whatsoever, I'm not going to do it. I need to have your full support. He adored her. He really adored her, and I'm telling you, when I went out there for those interviews, and he would go downstairs, and he would help her with dialysis, and then she'd come up and she'd be fine. I mean, they danced in front of me, and I had some meals at their house, and you know, and there are pictures in the book that kind of verify this. She was so grateful, just so grateful that she did not have to spend any of her life or her last years in a hospital or in a nursing home. She begged and pleaded, I want to die out here. I want to die out here. I want to, in this farmhouse. And she died on Christmas Eve 2020 in his arms. She died in his arms. And that's really is an amazing story. And how he changed there. He was proud of that. He was proud of how he went from a macho male who had been in the Marines to being a husband and a feminist, so to say. That he was able to change and that he was open to doing that. And he always encourages other men to think about that. And that it's to change worlds, a different world. That's what he tried to get through to the union members in the police department. The world is changing, guys. Life is changing. We have to change with it. It's difficult, but we can do this. So, yes.
My wife was a district attorney starting in the early 80s. I'd like to tell a story about some of those new recruits that he brought in. And there was a woman detective who was assigned to the stolen car section, and they, you know, all the guys told her, Jack, this is the worst place you can be, and you'll spend your time running around and you'll never catch anything. But she was so good at it that she could call these young thieves up. She'd find out who they were, call up on the phone, tell them, come on down with your car, yourself, turn yourself in, bring the car down. And she made that work multiple times because she'd been trained in David's way of thinking in community policing. And, yeah, he really put his stamp on the department and changed the way people went about.
And interactive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else? Anyone? Did you all live through the Couper era? Yeah, Georgie.
I'm kind of curious, after the Epiphany, you recall before that, and he said this before, that he had no real mentors before that, in those early days, even in his childhood. After that Epiphany, when he made that decision, did he acquire, did he seek out mentors after that, in those areas?
He did.
And who were they?
Yeah, you know, he did mention that there were religious people who had an influence, but we never really got into the details of that. I will tell you that he did say that, and I believe it's in the book, that after he had this epiphany, the next day he went downtown and he had his uniform on and he went into this religious bookstore downtown and he started looking for books on religious leaders, influential religious leaders, people who are respected in the religious community. And he said he felt so nervous being in there. He kept looking around because he thought people would say, what the heck's the police chief doing in this store with all these artifacts, religious artifacts and everything? And he compared it to, he said, the feeling I had at that time was almost as if I had gone into the red letter news porn store in East Washington in my uniform and was going, that's how I felt. It was like people, because he hadn't let it be known publicly yet that this was the direction he was going to take. And he said people would be shocked because Couper was not a religious guy growing up. And the other big moment that he said stuck with him forever, when he was in the Marines, he was among all the troops that were taken into the islands in the Pacific to witness the hydrogen bomb tests. And he said he was lying on the beach after the hydrogen bomb had gone off, and you see this mushroom cloud, and he's looking there, and he looks up after the cloud dissipates, and he sees all these stars. And you know, you could really see out the Pacific, you know, there weren't many lights or anything that would make it hard to identify. And he's looking up at these stars and he's thinking, for the first time he said, oh my God, how immense the universe is. We can't just be the only ones. And this can't have just been an accident. So there's got to be more to this than, you know, that it's just an evolutionary process or whatever. There's more to this. That's the first time he began thinking about religion. And it started to change it gradually. So, yes.
So you did a lot of interviews, you gathered a lot of information, but then you have to put it into a book.
Right.
Obviously, you couldn't put everything in the book.
Right.
How did you go through that process? And did David Couper say certain things must be in this book, or I want to tell that story?
He had absolutely no say. That was the other part of the deal. I would decide everything. I went back to him several times just to double check with what he told me, or he would tell me facts, and I, of course, research it and find out if that was true. But, you know, I did interviews with a tape recorder. I'm old school journalist, and I would go back and I would type out all the interviews. And then I would edit them and get out the stuff that I really didn't think was important or, you know, that people would find of interest, and I edited them down. The interviews lasted they were about an hour to an hour and a half. And yeah, of course, right before the interview, I would decide what I was going to talk about. And you know, I had a formula, I had a draft of what I was going to. It was a long process. And fortunately, where I was really lucky is that Couper not only opened up, he was known as a bad interview, as I said, early in his career, but he's so eloquent. And I will tell you there were a couple of nightmare situations, and I'm sure George can identify with this as a journalist. When the book was published by Little Creek Press, they sent me the first copy, And as I opened it up, it said, Rob Zaleski, Beyond the Badge, Reflections of an Ex-Cop by Rob Zaleski. And I said, that I wrote back to the publisher and I said, you're kidding, did you take a look at this? The first page, instead of David Couper, you've got Rob Zaleski, Beyond the Badge. Then a second printing probably had, and this is fairly common in the business, probably had 5 to 10 punctuation errors, misspellings, and then the craziest of all, and I kid you not on this, when I got the first printed copy of the book and I opened it up, now the interviews that I had with David Couper were casual, regular conversations. We spoke like people talking at a bar. The woman who edited the book looked at this and said, oh my God, this is bad grammar or whatever. So she changed all of the interviews and made them into proper English. And changed the punctuation, changed everything. Every quote was, was the kind, she was an ex-English teacher, I guess, and it bothered her that we had the conversation common, like people would have at a bar. And I contacted the publisher and I said, no, you've got to be kidding. You're going to have to reprint this. I mean, these are actual quotes. I used a tape recorder, okay? I'm sorry that this bothered her or they hurt her ear or whatever that she was reading it. But this has got to be changed, of course. And so it was changed back to the words that we used in the interviews. These are authentic quotes from actually what happened. I couldn't believe it, honestly. I don't think I slept for a week after that, thinking, oh my God, what else is going to happen? Now, having said that, I think they did a marvelous job in putting this book together. The final book was what I had hoped it would be, and I will say that the publisher of the book, I had sent her probably 10 possible pictures for the title, and she said, we got to go with this one that shows you actually interviewing Couper in 1990 when you were a columnist for the Capital Times. And I think it does work.
You have a lot better hair than
Yeah, right. The hair is, a little bit darker in the picture, and it doesn't have any of the wrinkles yet.
What's your next book?
I'm considering writing a kid's book at this point in my career. I think George would agree that one of the few benefits of getting older is that you do get wisdom, you gather wisdom. And I was very, very fortunate when I was growing up that I did have a number of mentors, including a guy who lived right next door to us named Earl Teifke, who I was in a lot of trouble as a kid. I got into a lot of fights. I was suspended from school. I was not a good student. The only subject I was good at in school was English. My kids get a kick out of the story that I flunked Geometry 2 when I was a junior in high school, when I got a 19 on the final exam. And the teacher gave 10 points automatically if you spelled your name right. So the book that I'm going to, the kids' book that I'm contemplating right now would be about this mentor that I had. And Milwaukee Braves player Henry Aaron plays a big role, would play a big role in the book. But the next door neighbor who was worked in the factory and was a Chicago Cubs fan, and he drank his Hamm's beer outside every night next to his dog, Ernie, named after Ernie Banks of the Chicago Cubs. He's the one, Baby was lily white at that time, a great place to grow up, except it was very racist, very homophobic. And Earl Teifke was a huge influence on me that got me to turn in the other direction and recognize how wrong that was. So that's the book I'm contemplating.
Okay, thank you.
$20.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. I shake your hand, but like Rob says, he has some books for sale in the back, so kind of go back and check it out. Again, next month, May 9th, we meet the War of 1812 in Wisconsin, Green Machine by Mary Louise Antoine. And then also on the way out, if you want to take a look at it, I have a couple flyers here. One is from the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. And I know there's a couple of us that probably support that. If you want to take a look at it, find out more about it, there's some flyers on the table. And Jenny Filer just gave me this. You had visited the Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, correct?
Yeah.
And so this is kind of a flyer about that, if you want to learn more about that. So
Yeah, the people who save books.
anyway, check that out. Have a good month, and we'll